Part 11. Computers and Life at Riley's. James picked up Greg from LAX on Tuesday morning. They greeted each other with a handshake and a good to see you. "How are you since christening?" said Greg with a mild stammer. "I try not to think about her too much. Work keeps me busy and I've met someone else," replied James, and added quickly, "I met her before the accident, though." Good man, said Greg, relieved and clearly pleased that his old friend had escaped the dark and lonely place he resided last time they met. "What's she like, this lady?" Greg ventured. "Like nobody else I've ever met before, and ever will meet," said James, momentarily slipping into dream mode. "That's good, very good," said Greg, relaxing into his seat. "About this job, James, any further news or information?" "Nothing in particular. I've narrowed down the number of people who are in a position to manipulate the inventory to 8. I'll give you their names when we get to the office. We've not let it be known to any of them that they're under suspicion, and there's one further complication." "Angela, my new lady, is one of them," said James. "Discretion is my byword," said Greg. "I know, and that's why you're here. Please, only report to me. If Vince, he's the president of the operation, asks for a report, give him a skeletal draft. By the way, he's on my list too," said James firmly. "No problem, anything you say," replied Greg seriously. They arrived at Chevalier's at 2:30, having stopped off at James's home to drop off suitcases. James introduced Greg to Vince. Formalities out of the way, the three men discussed the problems at the company. "Any idea of the scale of the fraud?" said Greg. James glanced at Vince, and Vince nodded. "As of yesterday, we calculate that inventory is missing to the value of $20 million over a period of 18 to 24 months. It may be more. I'll be able to firm up on that figure by Friday this week." Greg pursed his lips. "Wow, a fairly sizable figure then." "Somehow, the missing inventory has been included in our turnover, so it shows up as sales. We just don't know how it's being done," replied James. "I'll have a concrete plan once I've assessed the system," said Greg to James and Vince, before leaving Vince's office. "Do what you have to do, Greg, but try not to step on anyone's toes," said James pointedly. James and Vince continued their meeting alone. "Any movement on the stock register?" asked James. "No movement at all," replied Vince, shaking his head and adding thoughtfully, "The 20 million, do you think it could go much higher?" "I don't think it will be much more," said James. "We're going to have to speak to our bankers. We'll be in danger of breaching our covenants if this goes on any longer. There's one thing extending banking facilities due to increased sales, or even falling sales, but to extend them due to fraud, when we haven't stopped the fraud, is completely out of the question," said Vince pensively. "We'll sort it," said James firmly, looking at Vince's worried gaze. "I know you will, Jimbo," said Vince, breaking his stare and smiling at James. "Hi, gorgeous," said James as he peered around Angela's office door. "So you think I'm gorgeous now, do you?" said Angela, looking up at James. "You're always gorgeous," said James, smiling, and continued. "The guy who came in this afternoon, he's called Greg." "Good for him," said Angela, before James could continue. "Have I done something to upset you?" said James quizzically. "If you don't know, I can't help you," replied Angela, looking down towards her paperwork and tapping the end of her pen between her teeth. "Anyway, Greg is an old friend from Harvard, and he's working here for a time." James paused, cleared his throat, and continued. "He's staying with me too." Angela was unfazed and said, "I hope you'll both be very happy together." "If I've done something wrong, tell me. I don't think you're being very fair, not fair at all," said James, becoming exasperated. "So you don't know if you've done something wrong? Look, you go play with your friend from Harvard. I'm busy today, tonight, and for the foreseeable future. Shut the door on your way out, please." James gave up and shut the door firmly. Once gone, Angela dropped her pen, clasped her head between her hands, and shut her eyes. "Why did I do that?" she thought. In her mind she could hear a small voice. "He's getting too close." The voice kept on repeating. "Mars, it's James." "I know who you are, James," said Mars, holding the phone tightly to his ear. "What can I do for you, my friend?" he added. "My old Harvard friend Greg is here from Boston, And I wonder what Sandra had on the menu tonight, said James, wondering why everyone seemed to be so obtuse at present. I have no idea, mate. That's not my department, replied Miles evasively. You run the place. Surely you know what you're serving tonight, said James, his irritation increasing. No, I don't. I've been practising with the band. I'm doing a number tonight. The food'll be good, whatever it is. Bring Angela. She'll love it too. James paused, and there was a short silence other than the background music from Riley's, which was clearly audible down the phone line. James? James? We'll be there at 8. Please save a table. We won't be late, said James, frustrated by his friend. OK, see you. Bye, said Miles, shaking his head, little knowing that James would be doing precisely the same thing. What's up? Said Tate, looking at Miles. James, he's got more problems with Angela, replied Miles, grinning. What problems? Said Tate, looking concerned. I don't know. Just problems, said Miles, shrugging his shoulders. I'll give her a call, said Tate helpfully. Good idea, said Miles as he wandered off with his notes for the band. It's going to take me 2 or 3 days to familiarise myself with these systems, said Greg to James. It was 6 p.m. No point in carrying on today. I'm tired and I need some R&R, he added. That's fine, but are you making progress? Replied James. Yes. There's nothing too difficult or special about the system, as far as I can tell, but I need to get my head around the business and how everything works, said Greg seriously. Let's go then. I've got a treat for you tonight, said James, confident that Greg would like his new friend Mars, and Mars would put on a great show. What's that then? Said Greg. Never mind, just enjoy, replied James. You've made me curious, said Greg, looking forward to the evening. You'll have fun, said James, picking up his case as they left the office. James glanced towards Angela's office as they walked down the corridor towards the lift. She was still working. He thought about putting his head around her door and saying goodbye, but decided not to. I'll introduce you to Angela some other time. She's busy right now, said James. The guy you're meeting tonight is English. He's a good man, but completely mad, said James, changing the subject. The English are all mad, said Greg ruefully. Not like this one, said James, smiling. I think I'm going to like this friend of yours, James. The lift arrived, and the 2 men left the building, talking animatedly about the mad English. James and Greg walked into Riley's at 7:45 p.m, and were immediately greeted by Mars, who seemed in a particularly ebullient mood. He held out his hand to greet the 2 men. No tables available at the moment. You'll have to have a drink at the bar. Mars glanced at the clock. Anyway, you're early, he exclaimed. Where's Angela then? Tate said she was coming tonight, he added. No, it's just us. Tate must be mistaken, said James, looking puzzled. James introduced Greg to Mars and Tate, and eventually a table became available. Mars told the 2 friends some amusing anecdotes from his past before making his way to where the band had set up. Riley's had become very busy, and the clientele quietened down as Mars took the microphone and made his introduction. In addition to the band, we have some very beautiful young ladies here who will be singing backing vocals, courtesy of a very well-known glamorous fashion house. Everyone clapped and whistled, and the girls bowed and curtsied. My thanks to my very good friend James and his lovely girlfriend Angela, who introduced us to these lovely ladies. Miles waved his hand in the direction of the table occupied by James and Greg, and then towards the bar, where to James's astonishment, Angela was seated laughing and clapping.
I see us making something special. Believe me, relieve me. Take your time, there's no rush. Nothing can stop us. We're in the castle, built on the love. I don't care, no, I don't care. I don't care where we're going, where we're
James didn't hear much of the song, save for the opening lines. His sole focus of attention was on Angela. She seemed oblivious to him watching, but she wasn't, and revelled in her mischief. Greg, however, was up on the dance floor, dancing for all he was worth. When James finally turned and caught sight of Greg, he almost fell off his chair. He'd never seen Greg on a dance floor. He couldn't imagine Greg on a dance floor. James wished he had a camera. A picture of Greg dancing would be worth thousands at a Harvard reunion. The song finished, and Greg walked back to the table, laughing and looking over his shoulder towards the young women who danced with him. "Later, later," he called out as they gestured for him to stay with them. He was soon joined by Miles, who was buzzing. "What do you think, James?" said Miles, breathing heavily. "Brilliant. That was great," said Greg, trying to recover his composure. James laughed. "Nothing less than I've come to expect from you. Incidentally, your words always describe the way I feel," said James innocently. "I try to keep things real," said Miles, looking towards the bar to avoid eye contact with James. "You're becoming a romantic," said Greg. "You're the third person who's told me that within as many days," said James thoughtfully. "Must be true then," said Miles, playfully punching James on the arm. "I'll go over and get Angela to join you," said Miles, leaving the table. Some chance, thought James. "I'm sorry I couldn't join you earlier," said Angela, excusing herself. "I've been sorting things out with Tate. She's doing some freelancing for us," she continued. "This is Greg, an old friend of mine from," said James, but before he could finish, Angela interjected, "Harvard. Hi, I'm Angela. Pleased to meet you. James has told me so little about you." Greg leaned across the table and shook her hand and kissed her cheek. "He's told me a lot about you since I arrived," Greg offered. "Has he? You'll have to tell me more. Why are you shaking your head, James?" "I tried to tell you about Greg earlier, but you didn't mention the name Greg once, darling," said Angela, teasing James. "OK, I wanted to tell you," said James, thinking, "She's like a chameleon. This is another persona. What's she up to now?" "I'm pleased you got something sorted out with Tate," said James, changing the subject. "Are you?" replied Angela. "You guys having fun?" said Miles, who was still buzzing. "Yes, great," said James flatly, Greg happily, and Angela firmly, and all in unison. "Good," said Miles. "I believe that's good." "You two going to dance?" he ventured. "No," again in unison. "Well, at least you're unanimous," said Miles, smiling. All three laughed. "Come on," said James, taking Angela by the hand. "I'll sing something special for you," said Miles. It took Greg all week to familiarise himself with the company and the computer systems. James had all but finished crystallising the size of the fraud, and pressure was mounting on Vince to make a further statement to the NYSE, as the stock price began a gentle fall. Greg decided to work at the weekend, since nobody would disturb him, and he would have full access to all the terminals within Chevalier's. As the weekend approached, it became clear that Riley's was becoming a success. At lunchtime, Riley's was filled with women having lunch with their friends and businessmen out with clients. In the evening, it was full of people of every age group eating and drinking. Miles was in his element, and so too Tate, who helped Miles and worked on her freelance designs for Chevalier's part-time. Angela found a friend she could trust, although her hot and cold behaviour with James continued unabated. James would often call Miles to discuss Angela's strange ways, and Miles would always have an answer to James's current crisis. Greg was an easy house guest and willingly fitted into their lives. He liked Angela, and he could see why his friend was so attracted to her. She was beautiful, intelligent, and a challenge, and she would always be a challenge, he concluded. Furthermore, he had realised that there was something else, something intangible about James and Angela when they were together. They looked together. It felt to him as if they'd known each other before, maybe in a previous life. Sometimes she seemed so confident, other times she was like a child, full of insecurities. His friend didn't notice any of this. He was immersed in her. Greg wished he could find someone like Angela for himself. He concluded James was right when he said that everything happens for a reason, and it will only happen when the time is right. James and Greg arrived at Chevalier's at 9 a.m. that weekend Saturday and met Vince in his office. They outlined their plan, and all parties agreed that the plan would not be mentioned outside of Vince's office. Firstly, Greg wanted to make a backup of the entire system, not just the data, which was automatically backed up on mirror drives constantly and then once a week onto optical storage media. That might take more than one day, and Greg had bought in new optical storage media for the operation. There's nothing further we can do than wait, said James, and added, it's in Greg's hands now. Is there anything we can do to speed up the process? Asked Vince anxiously. Nothing. Computers are logical. They only run as fast as their processors, memory and storage systems allow them to, replied Greg, adding, I'll stay here until the systems are fully backed up. I'm not sure I'll be home tonight, James. James? Why is my name on a list? Said Angela when James returned from Chevalier's later that morning. What list, darling? Said James, looking for a saucepan to make breakfast, whilst Angela stood in the doorway, covered only by a towel. You know what list. There were 8 names on it, and one of them was mine, she said inquiringly. James had not realised that Angela had seen his notes, and was reluctant to tell her exactly what was going on. That list, as he tried to think of buying time. Just how many lists do you have with my name on it? Said Angela, annoyed that James was buying time to think. The list you refer to is a list of employees who have access to inventory control at Chevalier's, replied James, unable to think of a clever answer other than the truth. James, what's going on? Why do you need to know who has access to what? You're supposed to be an accountant, said Angela incredulously. I am an accountant, replied James, knowing full well that his answer would be wholly deficient in Angela's mind. Answer the question, darling, her voice firming. There's a problem with the accounts at Chevalier's, some inventory problems. We were trying to figure out what's wrong, said James, rather pleased that he found a way through the minefield. He hadn't. You already know what's wrong, don't you, darling? Said Angela, 1 degree under a sneer. Well, I know how big the problem is, replied James, concentrating on his saucepan and the beaten eggs residing in it. How many eggs, gorgeous? He inquired. Don't change the subject. You suspect me, don't you? Said Angela, barely able to contain herself. It's not like that. I don't suspect you or anyone right now, said James, trying to look more interested in the eggs. 2 for you, he quipped. Is that why you've got close to me? You just wanted to find out whether I'm up to something, her anger beginning to get the better of her. James could feel the pressure welling up inside of Angela. He had felt it before, and he knew he had to diffuse her before she blew. Look, Angela, darling, I don't suspect you of anything. I love you, and it's that simple, he said warmly. Bullshit! I can't take this any more. Don't call me, because I'm not in for you, ever. Angela threw her towel down and stormed upstairs, threw on her clothes whilst James protested his innocence. It was no good. She was gone. James could never work out how it was that one person could upset him so much. Nobody had ever had this effect upon him before. She really was the limit. For a while he sat down telling himself that it didn't matter and that he was better off without her. Unfortunately, after a couple of hours, this had changed to how he could win her back. As usual, Miles would provide the answers. How lucky he was to have such a friend. Miles was on a roll. Everything was going right for him. Tate was as happy as he'd ever known her to be. Riley's boys seemed happy with the deal he'd struck with them for free beers and a meal for acting as doorman for a night, although he suspected that the female clientele had as much to do with their happiness. His friend James was providing with the most inspiration for his music, and Pat was quiet. Sandra was doing a great job with the food. James's friend Greg was a good fellow, who had become fond of the place during his short stay in L.A. Tate had become more friendly, with reservations, with his mates in the band. All in all, a job well done. No wonder Miles was feeling great. James decided to drop into Riley's, since the eggs had burnt in the saucepan, and he really didn't feel like cooking anyway. He knew that the chances of Greg returning that night were negligible, so he took a cab rather than drive himself. Miles seemed overjoyed to see him, and immediately made him feel at ease. I've got to talk to you, Miles. I feel bad about bothering you, but, said James. What's happened now? Said Miles, looking concerned. James explained the events leading up to Angela's explosion. Hormonal? Said Miles assuredly. Yes, my friend, hormonal, he repeated. You think so? Said James, relieved that Miles was so confident. Am I ever wrong? Don't answer that. She always comes back, doesn't she? Said Miles, looking very intent. Yes, but she was so fired up this time, said James, suddenly unsure. She's a very confident woman. Tate's always saying how clever Angela is and how important her job is. She couldn't do a job like that if she weren't confident, could she? Replied Miles, pleased that he had convinced himself with his own logic. I guess, said James, feeling more unsure than ever. Look, Tate's seeing Angela tomorrow for lunch. I'll report to you after she's spoken to me. How's that? Can't do more than that, can I? Sounds pretty reasonable to me, said James, feeling comfortable that he had not only had advice from his friend, but from another angle from his friend's wife. Perfect. All possibilities covered. Where's Greg? Said Miles, hoping to lift his friend from the gloom. He's working tonight, replied James. So he'll be down later? Inquired Miles. No, he'll be working through the night, said James. Sounds serious. How's all that business going? Said Miles, hoping to move on with the conversation. It is serious. $24 million serious, plus a few $100,000 in change, replied James. You know something, Miles? What's that? Replied Miles attentively. I know I haven't known Angela long, but I really want to take it to the next level with her, said James soberly. Marriage? Exclaimed Miles. Keep your voice down, said James, looking around the bar furtively. No, not marriage yet. I wanted to move in. I see. I suppose you'll do what you did before and never get married then, said Miles, teasing James. That's not fair. This is different. I don't care where this goes. As long as it's with her, said James in a voice that he felt couldn't be heard by anyone other than Miles. How noble of you. Women always want to know where it's going. What are you offering her really? Said Miles, keeping James on the hook. Me, of course, me, replied James indignantly. I see. So you want her to move in, give up her life to be with you, offer her nothing more tangible than, I don't care where this is going, I just want to be with you, and you think that's good? Said Miles, grinning and shaking his head. You've misinterpreted me. What I mean is this. As long as I'm with her, I don't care what happens. If she wants marriage, that's fine by me, said James, exasperated that Miles couldn't grasp exactly what he was saying. I see. Yes, I do see. So why don't you ask her to marry you and stop all the crap? You know, cut to the chase, be a real man. If it's fine by her and it's fine by you, why are you beating around the bush? These people who wait eons and slide into marriage are doomed to failure. Take the bull by the horns and get married on the crest of a wave, not in the bloody trough, said Miles, sounding thoroughly convincing. She's not the marrying type. She told me, James complained. You think not? If she's met the right man, she'll want to get married, and that, my friend, is that, said Miles with authority. You think so? Said James, seeming very unsure, and continuing. When we went away together, I asked her why no one had snapped her up, so to speak, and she said, I'm not the marrying kind, and that was that. Absolute rubbish. She was only saying that not to frighten you off, replied Miles confidently. You sure? Said James. As sure as I am that if I don't help Tate, she'll want to hit me over the head with a beer bottle, said Miles, laughing. James secretly hoped Angela would appear in the bar later. She didn't. James had a bit too much to drink and went home before the bar got too packed. He would have liked to have stayed, but the drink caught up with him all of a sudden. Greg was clearly still at work, so he tried Angela a couple of times without success and went to bed. He awoke at 5 a.m. to hear a noise coming from downstairs. He leapt out of bed, tripped over his shoes, and almost fell over. What the hell's going on? Shouted Greg. Geez, it's you, Greg. For a minute I didn't know where I was or what I was doing. I just heard a sound. Greg turned on the lights. What were you hoping to do with that? He exclaimed, whilst laughing uncontrollably. James was naked other than one shoe, which he held in his right hand. James disappeared into the bedroom, put on his bathrobe, and said, All right, you've had your fun. Tell me some good news. The good news is that the system and all the data are backed up and they're sitting in your lounge. I'm not going in tomorrow. If I'd finished by midnight, it may be a different story, but it's 5:15 and I'm dead beat. Have we woken up Angela? Said Greg. Don't ask. She's not here. Why on earth have you brought all that computer stuff back here? Asked James. James, your brain must be fried. This is an investigation into fraud on a grand scale. Those optical drives represent the only backups we have of the entire system other than those at Chevalier's. Should the bandito, responsible for this fraud, suspect that we are onto him or her, These drives may represent our only opportunity to catch him or her, said Greg high-handedly. OK, let's hide them in a cupboard or something and get some sleep, said James wearily. Eventually, they hid the drives behind the kickboards underneath the kitchen units. Sunday is supposed to be a day of rest, and so it proved to be. James awoke at 11 a.m, went for a jog whilst Greg slept in till 2 p.m. James tried Angela a few times, but finally resigned himself to a quiet day. Meanwhile, Miles and Tate managed to lie until 10:30 a.m, and Tate only got up because she arranged to meet Angela at midday. Tate let herself into Angela's apartment block and took the lift up onto the 3rd floor. She was excited and looking forward to seeing Angela. She had some ideas sketched out and needed Angela's opinion before proceeding any further. She knocked on Angela's door and waited. Angela took a long time before opening the door, and head bowed she let in Tate. "What have you been doing, Angela? What's been going on?" Tate was shocked at the state of the apartment. There were clothes strewn all over the floors and a couple of wine bottles lying by the phone in the lounge. The kitchen was a disaster zone. It looked as though it had been hit by a hurricane. "I couldn't find a corkscrew," Angela explained when she finally looked up at Tate. Her eyes were bloodshot and her mascara formed 2 giant panda rings around her eyes. "Come on, let's get things cleared up," said Tate gently and trying hard to smile. The 2 women cleaned up the apartment whilst Angela explained what triggered off the episode. "Did it occur to you that James might not be able to tell you what's going on at work from a legal standpoint?" said Tate knowingly. "He could tell me, though, if he loved me," replied Angela. "Sometimes love doesn't come into things," said Tate, and added, "He has a very important job, a job that affects the lives of a lot of other people, and there are times where he can't tell anyone anything. If what I heard last night from Miles is true, he wants to marry you, and when a man like James makes up his mind, you better run for cover if you don't want him." "I don't believe it. He hasn't done or said anything along those lines," replied Angela. "He can't if you keep pushing him away, though, can he? Anyway, what's all this about not being able to find a corkscrew?" said Tate, raising her eyebrows. Angela giggled. "It's true," she said. "Really, believe me. I'll just get cleaned up and I'll be with you shortly, and thanks, Tate." "Take your time, lovely. I'll have a glass of wine," said Tate, smiling. Angela giggled and disappeared into the bathroom. She was out 15 minutes later. Angela and Tate looked through Tate's designs, and Angela made suggestions, and they agreed on the style Chevalier was looking for. Angela seemed much happier and appeared to have recovered from her latest bout of anxiety and lack of confidence. At 6 p.m, Tate was ready to leave. "Angela, I want to say something, but I'm frightened you won't want to be my friend. I'm willing to risk it, if it helps." "Tell me," said Angela, tilting her head. Tate drew a deep breath. "Angela, I don't think you can get through this on your own. I also know how quickly you can change when we talk and you start seeing things the way they are. What I'm saying is, you need to consider—" Angela interrupted. "You'd like me to see a shrink?" "I know, and I think I should. I didn't because I thought I could fight my way through all of this, but it never changes. I keep thinking it will, but it doesn't. You're right, things do seem different when I talk to you, but I've never had a proper girlfriend before." Tate threw her arms around Angela, and they both sobbed. Tate and Angela left the apartment block at the same time. Tate went to Riley's, and Angela to James's house. "Miles is extraordinary," thought James as he hugged Angela by the front door. "Greg's out visiting Miles. He won't be back till late," said James amorously. "What should we do to kill the time?" said Angela, batting her eyes. "One or two things spring to mind," said James suggestively. "Oh, James, and what might they be?" "I can tell you they both involve the bedroom," replied James. "And I thought you were square," said Angela, giggling as James led her up the stairs. "Whoever told you that is dead," said James, picking up Angela in his arms.